Have you ever wondered what it meant to be truly hungry, not for an hour or a day, but for months at a time, while winter buried your world in silence and ice? What did people eat when the earth itself turned hard as iron, when every meal required not just effort, but a quiet negotiation with survival itself? Tonight, we drift into the frozen kitchens of the Siberian frontier, where settlers lived through winters so long they seemed to erase the memory of warmth. We'll walk through dim cabins where breath turned to frost on the walls, where fires burned low to conserve precious fuel, and where a pot of thin broth represented not just a meal, but a small victory over the cold. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's grip on the early frontier, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you enjoy these slow passages through history's forgotten corners, please tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these stories can continue to find you in the stillness of late nights. Leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me where you're listening from, what hour it is in your corner of the world. Some of you may be settling in as darkness falls, others greeting the first light of morning, and some drifting through the spaces in between. Now, if you can, dim the lights around you, perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soft, constant hum that soothes the edges of thought. Let's begin our quiet journey into a world where winter was not a season, but a way of life, where every crumb mattered, every ember was precious, and where the simple act of eating carried the weight of survival. You open your eyes to darkness so complete, it feels solid, pressing against your face like cold cloth. The air inside your dwelling bites at your cheeks, your nose, the exposed skin of your neck where the threadbare blanket has slipped during the night. Your breath emerges as fog, hanging in the stillness before dissolving into the gloom. The walls around you, rough logs chinked with moss and clay, exhale their own cold, a deep chill that has seeped into the wood itself during the months of winter. Somewhere beneath the layers of felt and hide that cover you, your body has retained a small pocket of warmth. But the moment you move, the moment you pull your arm from beneath the coverings, the cold rushes in to claim that space. You lie still for a moment longer, gathering the will to face what must be faced. Outside, the wind moves across the snow with a sound like distant breathing, steady and patient. The fire has died to almost nothing during the night. You can sense this even before you look, can feel the absence of its warmth in the quality of the darkness, in the way the cold has crept closer to your sleeping place. When you finally push yourself upright, the world tilts slightly from hunger. Not the sharp hunger of a missed meal, but the constant, hollow sensation that has become so familiar you hardly notice it anymore, except in moments like this, when movement reminds you how little fuel your body is running on. Your feet find the earthen floor, and even through the strips of felt wrapped around them, the cold travels up through your legs. The floor is hard-packed dirt, frozen solid now, unyielding as stone beneath your weight. You move toward where the hearth should be, guided more by memory than sight. Your hands reach out into the darkness, fingers searching for the familiar shapes, the stone edge of the fire pit, the stack of birch bark kept dry for kindling, the iron poker that hangs from a nail driven into the log wall. The embers, when you finally locate them, are barely alive. A faint red glow nestles deep in the ash, so dim you might mistake it for an after-image, a trick of your dark-adjusted eyes. You kneel beside the hearth, joints stiff from cold and the awkward angles of sleep. The ash is fine and powdery, and you brush it aside carefully, exposing the tiny core of heat that has somehow survived the night. Your fingers, even in the warmth of summer, are calloused and rough from endless work. Now, in the depths of winter, they are something else. Cracked and raw, the skin split in places that never quite heal, that reopen each day with the work that must be done. You take a thin curl of birch bark from the stack, holding it near the ember. Birch bark is a gift in this frozen world. It burns even when damp, catches fire more readily than almost anything else, releases its oils in a quick, eager flame. But you must be patient now, must resist the urge to rush. You hold the bark steady, waiting for the heat to find it, for that first wisp of smoke to curl upward. The smoke comes before the flame, a thin thread rising into the darkness. It smells of resin and forests, a scent that speaks of summer even here, in winter's grip. You add another curl of bark, then another, building slowly, carefully. The flame, when it finally appears, is so small it seems impossible that it could matter, a flicker no larger than a fingernail, dancing uncertainly in the draught that seeps through gaps in the walls. But you protect it, cupping your hands around it without blocking its air, feeding it one sliver at a time. Gradually, reluctantly, the flame strengthens, spreading across the bark in small blue and orange tongues. The smoke thickens, filling the low-ceilinged space. There is no chimney here, or if there is, it draws poorly, and much of the smoke lingers, hanging in layers near the ceiling, working its way eventually out through the gaps in the roof, the spaces around the door. Your eyes water from the smoke, but you barely notice. This is simply how it is. Smoke is the price of warmth, and you pay it gladly. Once the kindling has caught properly, you begin adding small pieces of wood. Twigs first, then finger-thick branches, then finally logs, each one chosen carefully from your dwindling supply. Wood must be rationed as carefully as food, sometimes more so, because without fire there is no cooking, no warmth, no survival at all. The flames cast moving shadows on the walls now, transforming the dim interior into a space of shifting darkness and light. You can see the room properly for the first time since waking, the low ceiling barely high enough to stand beneath, the earthen walls reinforced with logs, the few possessions that represent your entire world. A rough table, barely more than boards laid across stumps. A single stool, its legs uneven, rocking slightly on the frozen floor. Bundles hanging from the rafters, dried fish tied in rows, strips of something that might be meat or might be leather, herbs gathered in the brief warmth of summer and now blackened with smoke. The sleeping platform where you spent the night, built against one wall and raised slightly off the floor to escape the worst of the cold. The blankets and hides piled there, never quite enough, never quite warm enough, and in the corner, partially buried in the floor itself, the entrance to your root cellar, a pit dug deep into the earth and lined with stones, where your winter stores are kept, where the food that will determine whether you live or die is slowly, steadily diminishing. The fire is burning properly now, and you turn your attention to the more pressing matter, breakfast, if it can be called that. The word itself seems too generous for what you are about to consume. You have a pot, iron and heavy, its outside black with soot from hundreds of fires. You take it to the cellar entrance, pulling aside the felt cloth that covers the opening to keep the cold from rising up, or perhaps to keep the warmth from sinking down. You are no longer sure which direction is the enemy. The smell that emerges from the cellar is earthy and damp, with an undertone of rot that you try not to think about. You climb down the crude ladder, feeling with your feet for the rungs, descending into darkness even deeper than the room above. Your stores are arranged along the walls of the pit, sacks of grain, if you are fortunate enough to have any, root vegetables buried in sand to keep them from freezing or sprouting, preserved fish, their scales catching what little light penetrates this depth. You run your hands over the stores, assessing by touch what you can barely see. The grain sack is lighter than it should be, lighter than it was even a week ago, the contents settling, compressing, somehow always less than you remembered. You take a small amount, a handful that seems pitiful, that seems impossible to stretch into something resembling a meal, but that represents a significant fraction of what remains. Each handful is a calculation, a weighing of today's hunger against tomorrow's, of your own needs against those of anyone else who depends on you. There are root vegetables here, turnips perhaps, or some kind of winter radish, grown small and hard in the brief growing season, stored now in hopes they will last until spring. You select two, their surfaces rough and cold, coated in gritty sand that gets under your fingernails. A chunk of something preserved in fat. You are not entirely sure what it was before preservation, whether fish or meat or something else entirely. It has been rendered down, pressed into a solid block, its original nature obscured by the process of making it last. You climb back up into the relative warmth of your dwelling, carrying your selections carefully. The pot must be filled with water, but the water barrel is nearly frozen, a skin of ice covering its surface that must be broken through. The ice cracks with a sound like breaking glass, sharp in the quiet morning. The water beneath is so cold it makes your hands ache when you dip the ladle in, makes your teeth hurt when you pour it into the pot. The pot goes over the fire, suspended from an iron hook that hangs from a beam. The water will take time to heat, time during which you can only wait, huddled near the flames, trying to absorb what warmth they offer. You take the roots and scrape at them with a knife, removing the worst of the dirt and sand, though never all of it. Some grit will always remain, will always grind between your teeth when you eat. The peel, what little there is, goes into the pot as well, because nothing can be wasted, nothing at all. The roots are hard as wood, resisting the knife, and cutting them takes effort that leaves your hands cramping. You slice them as thin as you can manage, knowing they will cook faster that way, knowing that thin slices will make the pot seem fuller, will create the illusion of abundance where there is none. The chunk of preserved fat goes into the water as well, bobbing on the surface before beginning its slow dissolution. It will add richness to the broth, calories that your body desperately needs, though the taste will be strange and strong, carrying the memory of smoke and salt and time. The handful of grain, you debate adding it now or saving it, always the same debate, the same calculation. Finally, you add half, reserving the rest, though for what purpose you cannot quite articulate, except that keeping something back feels like maintaining a reserve, a buffer against some future crisis that will inevitably arrive. The pot begins to steam, tendrils of vapor rising into the smoke-filled air. The smell that emerges is thin and unpromising, nothing like the rich aromas you remember from times of plenty, from celebrations and harvests that now seem like dreams from another life. You have nothing to do now but wait, watching the surface of the water begin to move, first with small bubbles rising from the bottom, then with a rolling motion that speaks of proper boiling. The roots slowly soften, releasing their pale essence into the liquid. The fat melts and disperses, creating an oily sheen that catches the firelight. There is bread, if you can call it that, a piece you saved from yesterday, or perhaps the day before you no longer remember clearly. It is hard as stone, dark and dense, made from rye flour that was probably never fresh, probably already half-spoiled when it was ground. You hold it near the fire to warm it slightly, not enough to toast, but enough to make it slightly less resistant to your teeth. Even so, when you bite into it, the crust threatens to crack your teeth, and you must soften each bite in your mouth before attempting to chew. The taste is sour and heavy, the texture coarse, with hard bits of chaff, or perhaps small stones that escaped the grinding. But it is food, it is substance, and you eat it slowly, making it last, alternating bites of bread with sips of the warming broth. The broth, when it is finally ready, is thin and pale, more like colored water than soup. The roots have softened to a slippery texture that slides in your mouth, almost tasteless beyond a faint earthiness and the strange tang of the preserved fat. You eat slowly, sitting on your stool near the fire, the pot balanced on your knees. The warmth of the pot seeps through your clothing, and you hold it there as long as you can bear the heat, stealing its warmth as much as its contents. Each spoonful is savored not for its flavor but for its warmth, for the way it briefly fills your stomach, creating a sensation of fullness that you know is temporary, an illusion that will fade within an hour or two, leaving you hollow again. But for this moment, in the dim light of your dwelling, with the fire crackling softly and the wind still moving across the frozen world outside, you are fed, you are warm, you are alive. When the pot is empty, scraped clean with bread that has soaked up the last drops of liquid, you set it aside and tend to the fire again, adding just enough wood to keep it burning low, conserving fuel for the long hours ahead. The morning routine is complete, and now the real work of the day begins. There are tasks that cannot be avoided, cannot be postponed, even in the depths of winter, even when the cold makes every movement painful, every action an effort. You must check your stores again, more carefully this time, assessing what remains, making calculations about how many more weeks the food will last, how much you can eat each day and still survive until spring. The mathematics of survival are simple and brutal. Not enough food divided by too many days equals slow starvation, equals a choice about who eats and how much, equals decisions no one should have to make. You must consider what can be gathered from outside, even in the dead of winter. There are bark strips that can be dried and ground into a powder, mixed with grain to stretch it further, adding bulk if not nutrition. There are frozen berries still clinging to certain bushes, hard as pebbles but edible if you can chip the ice away. There are roots beneath the snow if you can remember where they grow, if you can dig through the frozen earth to reach them. But gathering means going outside, means facing the wind and the cold, means expending energy that you barely have in hopes of finding calories that might not exist. Every expedition is a gamble, a weighing of effort against potential reward. You wrap yourself in layers, felt and wool and hide, whatever you have, wrapping your feet in extra cloth, covering your face with a scarf that will become stiff with frozen breath, pulling a hat down over your ears until you are shapeless, barely human, just a moving bundle of fabric against the white landscape. The door, when you open it, admits a blast of cold that seems impossible, seems like a physical force pushing against you. The world outside is blindingly bright after the dimness of your dwelling, the sun reflecting off snow in all directions, creating a glare that makes your eyes water and ache. The cold finds every gap in your clothing instantly, seeking out exposed skin, probing through the layers. Your breath catches in your throat, the air so cold it burns when you inhale, so cold your lungs protest against it. The snow is deep, deeper than it was yesterday. Fresh fall overnight creating drifts that reach past your knees in places. Each step requires effort, lifting your leg high, pushing through resistance, finding footing on the uncertain surface beneath. Your storage pit is outside, separate from your dwelling, a mound in the snow that must be located by memory and careful pacing. You count your steps from the door, following a path that exists only in your mind, because the snow has erased all tracks, has covered everything in fresh whiteness. When you reach the pit, you must dig through the snow to find the cover, boards weighted with stones meant to keep animals out, to keep the cold from penetrating too deeply. The snow has drifted against it, creating a slope that must be cleared away before the boards can be lifted. Your hands, even wrapped in cloth, begin to lose feeling almost immediately. The cold penetrates the fabric, makes your fingers stiff and clumsy, makes the simple task of gripping and lifting difficult. The pit, when you finally expose it, releases a plume of warmer air. Not warm by any normal measure, but less cold than the air outside. the difference noticeable, briefly comforting. The smell that rises is complex, earth and vegetables, and the beginning of rot, the inevitable decay that happens despite your best efforts, that claims some portion of your stores every winter, a tax paid to entropy and time. You descend into the pit, into the relative shelter it provides from the wind. Here, buried in the earth, you have stored the bulk of your winter supplies, sacks of turnips and beets, bundles of dried herbs, containers of animal fat, strings of dried fish and meat. But as you look around, assessing your stores by the weak light that penetrates from above, the reality of your situation settles over you like the cold itself. The turnips are smaller than you remembered, and several show signs of frost damage, dark spots that will spread, that will claim the entire vegetable if not removed soon. The grain sack, which should have been full at the start of winter, is now perhaps half full, the contents having been eaten steadily day by day, each meal diminishing what remains. At this rate, it will be gone before spring truly arrives, before the ice breaks and travel becomes possible again. The preserved meat, which you counted so carefully at the start of winter, assigning each piece a week, imagining it would last, is now reduced to just a few bundles. Some has been lost to mold despite the smoke, the white-green patches claiming the edges, forcing you to cut away and discard precious food. You select what you need for the next few days, trying to balance taking enough to avoid repeated trips outside against taking too much and exposing it to the warmer air of your dwelling where it might spoil faster. Everything is a calculation, everything a balance between competing risks. The fish you choose are stiff as boards, frozen solid, their eyes glazed with ice, their scales sharp enough to cut your fingers if you are not careful. They will need to thaw slowly by the fire before they can be prepared, before they can be added to the pot to make another thin, unsatisfying soup. The roots you select are unremarkable, just enough for a few more days of adding bulk to your meals, of creating the illusion that you are eating properly, that you are maintaining your strength, but you can feel in your body, in the weakness that comes upon you without warning, in the way your hands tremble sometimes when you lift the pot, that you are not maintaining anything. You are slowly, steadily diminishing, burning through your own reserves because the food is not enough, has never been enough. You emerge from the pit and carefully replace the boards, weighing them down again, piling snow back over them to insulate against the cold. Your hands are numb now, beyond cold into that dangerous absence of feeling, and you know you must get back inside quickly, must warm them by the fire before frostbite can set in. The journey back to your dwelling is the same as the journey out, high steps through deep snow, effort that leaves you breathing hard, breath emerging as clouds that freeze in your beard, in your eyelashes, in the scarf covering your face. Inside again, you lean against the closed door, breathing hard, letting the relative warmth of the space seep back into your body. Relative warmth. It is still cold enough that water would freeze, still cold enough that the walls exhale chill, but compared to outside it feels almost comfortable, almost bearable. You unwrap the cloth from your hands and hold them near the fire, watching the color return slowly, painfully, the sensation coming back as prickling needles that make you wince. You have seen frostbite enough times to know what to watch for, the white patches that don't pink up, the blisters that form later, the blackening that means the tissue has died, has become dead weight that will eventually be lost. The fish go on a shelf near the fire, positioned where they will thaw slowly without cooking. The roots go back into your indoor storage, added to what remains there, the collection slowly diminishing no matter how carefully you ration. There is work to be done inside as well, always work, clothing to mend, because the cold destroys fabric, makes it brittle and prone to tearing. Wood to split, carefully rationing your fuel supply, making sure each log is used as efficiently as possible. You have tools, but they are crude, An axe with a loose handle, a knife that has been sharpened so many times the blade has become narrow and weak, likely to break if you press too hard. Everything you own is worn, used past its intended life, held together by necessity and improvisation. The hours pass slowly, marked by the gradual movement of the small amount of light that enters through gaps in the walls, through the smoke hole in the roof. Time is strange in winter. The days are short, darkness coming early, but each day feels long, stretched out by cold and hunger and the endless waiting for spring. You add wood to the fire periodically, just enough to keep it alive, to maintain the minimal warmth that makes life possible. The pot goes back over the fire in the afternoon, filled again with water with one of the fish that has thawed enough to work with. Preparing the fish is tedious work, scaling it, gutting it, removing the head and fins, salvaging every possible bit of flesh. The innards you save as well, even these, they will go into the pot, will add their richness to the broth, because nothing can be wasted, nothing at all. The pot simmers through the afternoon, filling the dwelling with the smell of fish, a scent that is not entirely pleasant but is at least a smell of food, of sustenance. You add roots again, thin slices that will soften and stretch the meal, that will create bulk where there is little substance. There is a strange meditation in watching the pot, in tending the fire, in the slow passage of time. Your mind drifts, thinking of spring, of warmth, of green things growing, of the day when food will be less scarce, when each meal will not require this careful negotiation, this constant calculation of how little you can eat and still survive. But spring is far away, impossibly far, a dream that seems less real than the cold, less substantial than the hunger that has become your constant companion. Spring is measured in months, in weeks of winter that must still be endured, in snow that will fall and fall and fall before the thaw finally comes. Evening arrives early, darkness filling the spaces outside, pressing against the walls of your dwelling. You light a small oil lamp, precious oil, rationed like everything else, just enough to see by, to perform the necessary tasks before sleep. The fish soup, when it is ready, is better than the morning's meal, but not by much. The fish adds protein, adds some flavor, but the broth is still thin, the portions still small, the meal still inadequate to satisfy the hunger that gnaws at you constantly. You eat slowly, sitting by the fire, trying to make the meal last, trying to convince your body that it has been fed properly, even though you both know it is a lie. The warmth of the soup is perhaps its greatest virtue. The way it temporarily fills your stomach creates a sensation of fullness that will fade soon enough, but is real for this moment. After eating, you tend the fire one last time for the night, banking it carefully, covering the coals with ash to slow their burning, to preserve enough heat to make it through until morning. You have become an expert in this, knowing exactly how much wood to add, exactly how to arrange the coals, exactly how to balance the need for warmth against the need to conserve fuel. The sleeping platform calls to you and you pile on the blankets and hides, crawling beneath them fully clothed, because removing clothing would mean losing the warmth trapped against your skin, would mean starting the next morning even colder than necessary. The darkness inside your dwelling is complete now, the lamp extinguished to save oil, the fire reduced to a faint glow beneath the ash. Outside, the wind continues its endless movement across the snow, a sound that is always there, a backdrop to everything, the voice of winter itself. Your body curls instinctively, seeking warmth, conserving heat. Your stomach, no longer distracted by the warmth of the soup, reminds you that it is still hollow, still hungry, still waiting for more than you can give it. Sleep comes slowly, the cold making it difficult to relax, to surrender, to rest. But eventually exhaustion wins, and you drift into unconsciousness, into dreams that are often about food, about warmth, about the end of winter, and the promise of spring. And tomorrow you will wake to the same darkness, the same cold, the same empty pot and dwindling stores. Tomorrow you will revive the fire again, will prepare another inadequate meal, will ration your supplies and wonder if they will last, will make the same calculations and the same choices. This is what it means to be a frontier settler in winter, not adventure, not romance, but this grinding daily repetition, this constant negotiation with cold and hunger, this slow passage of time measured in meals that never satisfy, in fires that never warm quite enough, in nights that stretch endlessly toward a spring that may never come. The struggle is quiet, undramatic, a private battle fought in silence and isolation. There are no heroic moments, no dramatic victories, only the simple fact of survival, of waking each morning and beginning again, of keeping the fire alive and yourself alive, of enduring because there is no alternative, because giving up means freezing, means starving, means becoming another silent casualty of a winter that takes and takes and takes, indifferent to your suffering, indifferent to your hopes, as patient and as cold as the ice that holds the world in its grip. Let us drift now from the general struggle to one particular life, to a woman whose name has been lost to formal history, but whose story survives in fragments, in whispered memories, in the kind of quiet legacy that passes between generations, not through documents, but through the simple act of survival itself. We will call her Anya Morozova, though that name is a composite, a gathering of many women into one, all of them sharing the same essential truth, that they fed their communities through impossible winters, that they turned scarcity into sustenance through knowledge passed down in kitchens and cellars, through skills learned at their mothers' sides. Anya was born in the early spring of 1789 in a settlement so small and remote it appeared on no maps, existed in no official records, mattered to no one except those who lived there. Her first breath was taken in a dwelling much like the one we have just inhabited, low and dark and perpetually cold, the kind of place where survival was always provisional, always uncertain. Her mother was a woman whose hands were never still, always working, preserving, preparing, calculating the months of winter against the brief abundance of summer. Anya's earliest memories were not of stories or songs, but of processes, of watching her mother's hands move through the rituals of making food last, of transforming the fresh and living into the dried and preserved, of turning abundance into insurance against the inevitable cold. She learned to smoke fish before she learned to read, learned to recognize which berries dried well and which turned bitter, learned the particular patience required to render fat properly, to achieve that perfect texture that would keep without spoiling, that would provide calories when nothing else remained. These lessons were not formal, were not announced as education. They simply happened, absorbed through proximity and repetition, through helping with small tasks that gradually became larger responsibilities. The settlement where Anya grew up existed at the very edge of what could be called civilization, a fragile cluster of dwellings clinging to existence in a landscape that seemed designed to reject human habitation. Around her stretched the taiga, endless and indifferent, a forest so vast that a person could walk for weeks without encountering another human being, where wolves moved in the shadows and winter cold could kill with a speed that seemed almost purposeful. By the time Anya was 12, she could gut and clean a fish faster than most adults, could identify by touch which roots would store well and which needed to be eaten quickly, could judge by smell whether preserved meat was still safe or had crossed that invisible line into dangerous decay. Her hands already bore the marks of her work, small scars from knives, roughness from cold water, a permanent smell of smoke that no amount of washing could remove. She had dreams, though she knew better than to speak of them often. She wanted a proper hearth someday, one of those ceramic stoves she had heard about, the kind that held heat for hours, that radiated warmth evenly, that didn't fill the room with smoke. She imagined a kitchen with shelves, with enough storage, that food wouldn't need to be piled in corners, where everything had its place and its purpose. More than that, she dreamed of her future children. Children who would not know hunger as she had known it, who would grow up strong and healthy, whose winters would be hard, but not desperate, not life-threatening. This was the modest scope of her ambition, not wealth or status, but simply enough, simply adequate, simply the absence of the grinding anxiety that came with each winter's approach. She watched other girls in the settlement dream of fine dresses or travel to distant cities, dreams that seemed as fantastical to Anya as flying, as disconnected from reality as fairy tales told to entertain children on long winter nights. Her adolescence was marked by the gradual accumulation of knowledge that would define her adult life, each season teaching her something new about survival, about the delicate balance between preparation and catastrophe. She learned to read the sky for weather signs, to interpret the behavior of animals as indicators of coming cold, to sense in the quality of autumn light whether the winter would be merely harsh or truly brutal. At 19, she married a man named Pyotr, a hunter and trapper whose skills complemented her own, whose knowledge of the forest and its animals balanced her knowledge of preservation and preparation. Their marriage was practical in the way frontier marriages were, less about romance than about survival, about creating a partnership that could withstand winter, that could produce and raise children, that could build something lasting in this harsh place. The wedding was a simple affair, a brief ceremony followed by a modest feast that the entire settlement attended, bringing contributions of food and drink that represented real sacrifice in a place where every scrap of abundance mattered. Anya wore a dress her mother had worn, altered to fit her smaller frame, and she felt in that moment both the weight of tradition and the terrifying responsibility of beginning her own household, her own survival story. They built their own dwelling, dug their own cellar, established their own small claim on the edge of the settlement. Anya planted a kitchen garden in the brief growing season, coaxing vegetables from soil that seemed barely willing to support them, extending the growing period by covering the plants with cloth on cold nights, harvesting frantically when the first serious frost threatened. The first year of marriage was hard in ways Anya had not anticipated, not because of conflict with Pyotr, but because of the sheer magnitude of work required to establish a household from nothing. Every tool, every piece of furniture, every storage vessel had to be made or acquired through trade, and the process consumed time and energy that seemed infinite. She gathered knowledge wherever she could find it, from older women in the settlement, from indigenous traders who passed through occasionally, from her own experiments and failures. She learned that certain types of bark, when dried and ground fine, could be mixed with grain to stretch it further without making people sick. She learned which herbs helped preserve food and which added flavor to otherwise bland meals. She learned the timing of everything, when to harvest, when to smoke, when to bury things in the cellar, and when to keep them above ground. When her first child was born, a daughter she named Katya, Anya felt the weight of responsibility settle over her like a physical thing. This tiny person depended entirely on her ability to produce enough milk, which depended on her having enough food, which depended on her stores lasting through winter, which depended on her skills and knowledge and careful planning. The chain of dependency was clear and unforgiving. She nursed Katya through that first winter, feeling her own body growing thinner as she converted her meager rations into milk, as she gave to her daughter what she could not give to herself. Pyotr hunted when weather permitted, bringing back rabbits and occasionally larger game, but the winter was long and the hunting often unsuccessful, and many days the pot contained nothing but water and roots and the memory of better times. Anya learned during that first winter with an infant what her mother must have learned, what every woman in this place eventually learned, that motherhood here meant a constant calculation of sacrifice, a daily decision about how much of yourself you could give away and still survive to give more tomorrow. 2 more children followed, a son named Mikhail and another daughter, Sonia. With each child, Anya's calculations became more complex, her rationing more careful, her preservation techniques more refined by necessity. She could not afford waste, could not afford mistakes, could not afford the luxury of abundance even in summer, because summer was simply preparation for the next winter's siege. The dwelling that had seemed adequate for 2 adults now felt cramped with 3 children, the air thick with the breath and warmth of 5 bodies, the resources stretched thinner with each mouth to feed. The settlement grew slowly over the years, new families arriving, some staying, some leaving, after one brutal winter convinced them they had made a terrible mistake. Anya became known as someone who knew things, who could advise on preservation, who could look at someone's winter stores and calculate whether they would last, who could suggest solutions when food ran dangerously low. She did not seek this role, did not announce herself as an expert. People simply began appearing at her door, asking questions, seeking advice. An older woman wondering if her grain had spoiled. A young mother worried about feeding her family, her eyes hollow with the specific fear that comes from watching your children go hungry while you stand helpless. A man whose storage pit had flooded, ruining half his supplies, his voice tight with the terror of staring at a long winter with inadequate provisions. Anya helped when she could, sharing what she knew, sometimes sharing from her own supplies when someone else's need was desperate. She taught younger women the tricks her mother had taught her, how to make fish last longer through proper smoking, how to identify the first signs of rot, how to ration without feeling like you were starving, how to make thin broth taste like something more substantial. These teaching moments often happened in her dwelling. Women crowded around her small hearth, watching her hands move through familiar motions, absorbing knowledge that might mean the difference between life and death when winter came. The years between Katya's birth and the terrible winter of 1821 were not easy, but they were manageable, each season following the pattern established over generations. Brief summer abundance, frantic autumn preparation, long winter survival, spring relief. Anya's children grew, her skills deepened, her reputation as someone knowledgeable about survival became established not through any formal recognition, but through the simple fact that people kept seeking her advice, and that advice kept proving useful. She developed relationships with indigenous families who lived in the broader region, relationships built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that survival in this place required every scrap of knowledge anyone possessed. From Evenki women, she learned techniques for preserving meat in ways that required less salt, a precious commodity. From Yakut traders, she learned about rendering fish oil for both food and fuel. From Buryat families, who passed through occasionally, she learned about identifying edible plants that grew even in harsh conditions, species that Russian settlers had dismissed as useless but which contained nutrients that could sustain life when nothing else remained. The winter of 1821 arrived early and announced itself as something different, something worse than usual. The first snow fell in late September, far earlier than expected, catching people unprepared, with harvests incomplete, with preservation work still undone. The snow continued through October, heavy and persistent, burying the landscape under drifts that made travel nearly impossible. Anya watched the snow accumulate with growing dread, her mind racing through calculations that all arrived at the same grim conclusion. They were not ready, the settlement was not ready, no one was ready for a winter that started this early and showed this much intensity. By November, it was clear that this would be a winter of crisis. The early snow had prevented the final hunting season. Animals had gone to ground early, migrated before hunters could take them. Fish runs had been poor that year for reasons no one understood, and the stores of dried fish were smaller than they should have been. Several families' cellars had problems: flooding from early melt and refreeze cycles, infestations of mice that destroyed grain stores, structures that collapsed under the weight of wet snow. Anya looked at her own supplies and felt the familiar anxiety tighten in her chest. She had enough for her own family, probably, if they were very careful, if no one got sick, if they stretched everything as far as possible. But she knew her neighbors were in worse condition. She had seen their stores, had heard the worry in their voices, had done the same calculations they were doing, and arrived at grim conclusions. The mathematics of survival were brutal and simple. So many people, so much food, so many months until spring. And when you added those numbers together honestly, the result was catastrophic. The settlement met in the largest dwelling, everyone crowding into a space meant for one family, the combined body heat creating something almost like warmth. The discussion was careful, euphemistic, people speaking around the central fear rather than naming it directly. Not enough food, long winter ahead. Some families with children, limited supplies, elderly members who needed more to survive. The unspoken question hanging over everything: who would survive this winter and who wouldn't? Proposals were made, rationing schemes, sharing arrangements, plans to send hunting parties out despite the snow, despite the danger. But Anya listened and heard the desperation underneath the planning, heard people trying to solve a problem that might not have a solution. She found herself speaking, almost without deciding to, her voice quiet in the crowded room, but somehow carrying. She had been thinking, she said, about ways to stretch what they had. She had learned some techniques from Evenki women she had met years ago, methods of extracting nutrition from things that seemed inedible, inner bark from certain trees, lichens that grew on rocks, roots that most people dismissed as worthless. She had been experimenting with stone heating methods that used less wood but cooked food more efficiently, a crucial consideration when fuel was as scarce as food. More than that, she said, she was willing to help coordinate the settlement's resources, to teach anyone who wanted to learn, to work with each family, to maximize their supplies. It wasn't a solution exactly, but it was something, a way of facing the crisis collectively, rather than as isolated families struggling alone. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People wanted her help, wanted her knowledge, wanted her presence in their homes, looking at their stores and telling them what to do. Some were skeptical. Winter was survival of the fittest. Why should successful families share their knowledge or resources with those who had prepared poorly, who had been lazy or foolish or simply unlucky? But most saw Anya's offer for what it was, a thin thread of hope in a situation that offered very little. The days that followed were exhausting in new ways. Anya moved between dwellings, assessing each family's situation, offering specific advice, teaching techniques, helping to reorganize storage systems for maximum efficiency. She showed people how to make survival cakes, dense, barely palatable combinations of grain, ground bark, animal fat, and whatever else could be compressed into something edible. She demonstrated the stone heating method, how to heat rocks until they glowed, and then drop them into pots of water, creating boiling heat without maintaining a large fire. She taught people how to render every possible calorie from fish, using the bones to make broth, drying the skins to add to soup, even finding uses for the scales and swim bladders. Nothing could be wasted, she insisted, nothing at all, because the margin between survival and starvation was measured in ounces, in individual bites of food, in the difference between using every part and throwing some parts away. Her own family's stores diminished faster than she had planned, because she found herself unable to refuse when someone showed up at her door, hollow-eyed and desperate, asking if she had anything to spare. She gave when she shouldn't have, shared when her own children looked at her with hungry eyes, calculated and recalculated, and always arrived at the same impossible equation. There was not enough, there would never be enough, and yet, somehow, they would have to make it work. Pyotr hunted whenever possible, pushing out into the snow despite the danger, despite the cold that could kill in minutes if you became disoriented, if you fell through ice, if you simply gave up and stopped moving. He brought back small game when he could find it, and Anya made each rabbit, each bird, stretch across multiple meals, across multiple families, the meat distributed not according to who had earned it, but according to who needed it most, desperately. The carcass of a single rabbit, which in better times might have fed one family for 2 meals, now became the basis for a thin soup that fed 6 families, the bones boiled and reboiled until they gave up every trace of nutrition they contained. The indigenous families who lived in the region, Evenki and others who had survived here for generations before Russian settlers arrived, noticed the settlement's crisis and responded with a pragmatism born of long experience with harsh winters. They appeared periodically with offerings of dried reindeer meat, with knowledge about edible lichens and bark, with techniques for surviving cold that the settlers had never learned. Anya worked closely with these teachers, learning and then passing on what she learned, building bridges between communities that had often existed separately, suspiciously. She learned about fat-rendering traditions from Yakut families, about cold weather preservation from Buryat traders, about which plants could be gathered, even in winter, from Evenki hunters who knew the land in ways she never would. The exchange went both ways. The indigenous families appreciated Anya's grain-stretching techniques, her methods of smoking fish, her organizational skills in managing communal resources. An informal network of knowledge-sharing emerged, pragmatic and focused on survival rather than on the cultural barriers that usually separated the groups. December passed in a blur of cold and hunger, each day, much like the last, marked only by small crises, a family running out of fuel, a child showing signs of malnutrition, someone's cellar flooding despite all precautions. Anya responded to each crisis as it arose, improvising solutions, redistributing resources, teaching and helping, and somehow, impossibly, keeping the settlement functioning. Her children grew thinner despite her best efforts. Katya, now 12 and old enough to understand what was happening, tried to refuse food, tried to save her portion for her younger siblings. Anya had to insist, had to explain that everyone needed to eat something, that starving yourself didn't help anyone, that they would survive this together or not at all. Mikhail developed a cough that wouldn't go away, a wet sound that spoke of cold and damp and insufficient nutrition. Anya made special broths for him, adding what little fat she could spare, watching anxiously as he struggled to keep warm, to keep eating, to maintain the strength needed to fight off whatever was settling into his lungs. Little Sonia, only 5 years old, became quiet in a way that worried Anya more than crying would have. The child stopped asking for food, stopped complaining about hunger, simply accepted whatever was given and ate it mechanically, without interest or pleasure. It was the behavior of someone much older, someone who had learned to expect disappointment, and seeing it in her youngest daughter broke something in Anya's heart. January was the nadir, the lowest point, the time when winter seemed eternal and spring seemed like a myth someone had invented to make the present bearable. The cold reached depths that made breathing painful, that froze water in seconds, that killed anyone foolish enough to venture far from shelter without extreme precautions. Supplies that had seemed adequate in November now seemed catastrophically insufficient. The careful calculations Anya had made were proving optimistic. People were eating less than planned, and still the stores diminished faster than they should. Waste had been minimized to the point of impossibility, and yet somehow there was still not enough. Anya's own cellar was nearly empty. The grain sack, which had started the winter full, now contained perhaps a week's worth, if rationed carefully. The preserved fish were gone, every last one consumed in the months of constant hunger. The root vegetables were gone, even the ones that had started to rot, and which she had carefully trimmed and used before the decay could spread. What remained was the survival cakes she had taught others to make, dense, unpleasant, but containing calories, containing life. She made a decision that terrified her. She would give her family's remaining supplies to those in more desperate need, and they would live on the survival cakes alone. It was not martyrdom, but calculation. Her family was strong enough, just barely, to survive on minimal rations, while other families had elderly members, sick children, people who would die if they received any less food than they were already getting. Pyotr objected, quietly but firmly. His duty was to his own family first, he said, his voice tight with fear and frustration. How could they help others if they themselves starved? What good would it do for all of them to die together, for his children to perish because their mother had been too generous, too willing to sacrifice her own family for strangers? Anya listened and understood his fear, felt it herself coursing through her veins like ice water, the primal terror of watching your children waste away. But she also understood something else, that they were all going to survive or none of them were, that the settlement functioned as a collective, or it didn't function at all, that her children's survival depended not just on having food, but on being part of a community that had survived together, that would remember what they had done, that would repay the debt in future winters, in future crises. She explained this to Pyotr, explained it to her children, and saw understanding dawn in their faces. It was not what anyone wanted, but it was what needed to happen. They distributed their remaining good food and began living on the survival cakes, dense, dry, tasting of nothing good, but filling the stomach, providing calories, keeping them alive. The settlement noticed what Anya's family had done, and the response was quiet but profound. Other families, seeing the example, began sharing their own remaining supplies more freely. A collective meal system emerged, each family contributing what they could to a common pot, everyone eating the same thin soup, the same survival cakes, no one getting more than others, no one hoarding while neighbors starved. It was not abundant, not even adequate by any reasonable standard, but it was fair. And in the depths of that terrible winter, fairness mattered more than abundance, equality mattered more than plenty. People drew strength not from full stomachs, but from the knowledge that they were facing the crisis together, that no one was suffering alone, that the burden was shared. Anya became the coordinator of this system, the one who moved between dwellings collecting contributions, distributing shares, making sure the elderly and the very young received slightly larger portions, ensuring that hunters who ventured out into the cold received enough food to maintain their strength. She became, without anyone formally naming her as such, the keeper of the settlement's collective survival. The days blurred together in exhaustion. Anya slept little, moving constantly between tasks, checking on families, teaching new techniques, redistributing resources, solving problems as they arose. Her body grew thin, her face gaunt, her hands developing tremors from cold and hunger and fatigue, the skin cracking and bleeding in the relentless cold despite her efforts to protect them. But she kept moving, kept working, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the fear that lived just beneath her constant activity, the fear that it wouldn't be enough, that despite everything they were doing, despite all the knowledge and effort and collective will, some of them would die before spring came, that she would have to watch children starve, that her own children might be among them. February brought no relief, just more cold, more snow, more grinding hunger. But it also brought something else, a kind of grim endurance, a realization that they had made it this far, that each day survived was one day closer to spring, that they had found a way to continue that worked, barely, but worked. Mikhail's cough improved slightly, with the regular if minimal food, the consistency of nutrition making more difference than the quantity. Katya grew thinner but remained strong, helping her mother with the daily work of survival, moving between dwellings with messages and small contributions of food, becoming a smaller version of Anya herself. Sonia's quietness persisted, but she continued eating, continued living, holding on to life with the tenacity of childhood, with that determination that exists before we learn to give up. The settlement as a whole stabilized into a new normal. Constant hunger, yes, but not starvation. Weakness, yes, but not collapse. Each person, thinner than they should be, slower than they should be, but alive, functioning, waiting for spring with a patience born of having no other choice. Anya's reputation spread beyond the settlement. Neighboring communities heard about the woman who had organized survival, who had kept her settlement alive through sharing and skill and stubborn refusal to let anyone die. Visitors came when weather permitted, arriving on snowshoes or sleds, asking for advice, learning techniques, taking knowledge back to their own struggling communities. She taught them what she knew, holding nothing back, understanding that survival knowledge was not meant to be hoarded but shared, that the more people who knew how to survive, the better chance all of them had. March arrived with no sudden warmth, no dramatic thaw, just a gradual softening of the cold's grip. The days grew incrementally longer, each one adding a few more minutes of light, the sun climbing higher in the sky, its angle changing in ways that promised eventual warmth. The quality of the light changed, becoming slightly less harsh, suggesting that somewhere, somehow, spring was gathering its strength for the return. The first bird appeared in mid-March, a small brown thing whose name Anya didn't know but whose presence meant everything. Birds meant warming weather, meant insects returning, meant the cycle of life resuming after winter's pause. Children who had been too weak to play found the energy to chase the bird, to laugh for the first time in months, the sound of their laughter, strange after so much silence and hardship. The ice on the river began to crack in early April, great splitting sounds that echoed across the landscape, announcing the breakup, the thaw, the return of flowing water. Fishing would be possible again soon, the river would provide food again, the isolation would end. Travel would be possible again, the trails that had been impassable under deep snow, now accessible. The isolation that had trapped them all winter was ending, and with it the feeling of being cut off from the world, abandoned to their fate in this remote place. The first green shoots appeared in late April, grass pushing through the melting snow, early plants emerging, tough and determined. Anya and other women gathered them immediately, these first fresh foods, after months of dried and preserved rations. They tasted like resurrection, like hope, like proof that they had survived. The bitterness of early greens, which in normal times people might have found unpleasant, now tasted like the finest delicacy, each leaf representing life returning, the earth providing again after its long withdrawal. By May, winter's grip had clearly broken. Rivers flowed freely, the ice gone completely, the water running fast and cold with snowmelt. Animals returned from wherever they had sheltered, appearing suddenly in the forest, their tracks visible in the mud, their sounds filling the air after months of silence. Plants grew with visible speed, racing to complete their cycles in the brief growing season, the landscape transforming from white and dead to green and living in a matter of weeks. The settlement emerged from their dwellings into sunlight that felt impossibly warm, that required them to shed the layers they had worn for so long, that touched skin that had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. Anya stood outside her dwelling one morning, feeling the sun on her face, listening to the sound of her children playing, actually playing, with energy, with joy, and felt something release inside her chest. They had survived. Against all probability, against the odds, against winter's best efforts to kill them, they had survived, and that simple fact seemed more miraculous than anything she had ever experienced. The settlement counted its losses, livestock. Yes, some had died, unable to survive on the minimal feed available. Supplies, yes, they were depleted beyond recovery this year, every storehouse empty, every cellar bare, nothing left to carry over into next winter's preparations. Health? Yes, everyone bore the marks of malnutrition, of illness, of months of extreme cold, their bodies thinner and weaker than they should be. But people, actual people, there had been no deaths, not one single life lost. Every person who had started that terrible winter was still alive to see spring. It seemed impossible, seemed like a miracle, though Anya knew it was not miracle but work, not divine intervention but human cooperation, not magic but the application of knowledge and the willingness to share resources and burden collectively. Still, it felt miraculous, felt like something worth celebrating, felt like an achievement that deserved recognition. The settlement held a feast, modest by any standard, but abundant compared to winter's rations. Fresh fish from the river, caught in the newly accessible waters and grilled over open fires, green plants gathered from the forest, their bitterness balanced with the fat from the fish, creating flavors that seemed impossibly rich after months of bland survival food. Small game hunted in the newly accessible terrain, rabbits and birds that had emerged from their winter hiding places. Everyone ate until their stomachs hurt, until they were uncomfortably full, making up for months of hunger in one evening of excess, their bodies almost rejecting the sudden abundance after adapting to scarcity. Speeches were made, toasts offered with fermented drinks carefully saved for such an occasion. Someone mentioned Anya's role, her teaching, her coordination, her willingness to share her family's supplies when others needed them more, and suddenly everyone was looking at her, nodding in agreement, acknowledging what she had done. The settlement gave her a title that night, the Keeper of Warmth, not because her fire had burned brighter than others, but because she had maintained the warmth of community, of cooperation, of collective survival through the coldest winter anyone could remember. Anya accepted the recognition with embarrassment and gratitude, but mostly with exhaustion. She was tired in ways that sleep wouldn't fix, tired in her bones and her soul, tired from months of constant anxiety and effort and fear. She wanted rest, wanted time to simply be, wanted to watch her children grow without constantly calculating whether there would be enough food to keep them alive, without the weight of responsibility for entire families pressing down on her shoulders. The years that followed were easier, though never easy. Winters came and went with their usual severity, but the settlement had learned something that winter of 1821. They had learned how to survive collectively, how to share knowledge and resources, how to organize for mutual survival rather than individual struggle. Anya's techniques became standard practice, taught to newcomers, passed down to the next generation, incorporated into the basic knowledge that everyone in the settlement possessed. The communal meal system became a regular practice during hard times, activated whenever supplies ran low, ensuring that no one starved while others had surplus. She grew older, her hair turning grey, her hands becoming more gnarled with arthritis and age, the joints swelling and stiffening until simple tasks became painful. Her children grew up and had children of their own, and she taught them the same skills her mother had taught her, the same knowledge she had learned from indigenous neighbors, the same techniques she had invented through necessity and experimentation, creating an unbroken chain of survival knowledge stretching from past to future. Katya married a man from a neighboring settlement and stayed nearby, often bringing her own children to learn from Anya, to hear stories of that terrible winter, to understand where the techniques they used came from. Mikhail became a skilled hunter like his father, but he also learned preservation techniques from his mother, understanding that hunting was only half of survival, that what you did with the meat afterward mattered as much as acquiring it in the first place. Sonia, the quiet child who had survived that winter with such determination, grew into a woman who specialized in herbal medicine, combining Anya's practical knowledge with learning from indigenous healers, creating treatments that helped people survive the illnesses that came with malnutrition and cold. When Anya died in the spring of 1854 at the age of 65, the settlement mourned her as they would mourn few others. She had been not just a neighbor, but a teacher, not just a community member, but its keeper, not just a survivor, but the reason others had survived. Her funeral was attended not only by her own settlement, but by people from surrounding communities, indigenous families who had worked with her over the years, travelers who had learned from her and carried that knowledge elsewhere, creating a gathering that represented the full extent of her influence. Her legacy was not written in documents or recorded in official histories. It lived in the survival techniques that became standard practice, in the communal meal systems that persisted in times of crisis, in the tradition of sharing knowledge across cultural boundaries, in the collective memory of that terrible winter when one woman's skills and generosity had meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. And perhaps more than anything, her legacy lived in the understanding that winter, harsh, brutal, unforgiving winter, could be survived not through individual strength, but through collective action, not through hoarding, but through sharing, not through competition, but through cooperation. She had shown that the hearth that matters most is not the one in your own dwelling, but the warmth you create in the spaces between people, the connections that sustain life even when food is scarce and cold is overwhelming, the bonds that make survival possible when individual effort would fail. This was Anya Morozova's winter, a season of extremity that revealed both the depths of hardship and the heights of human capacity for compassion, for ingenuity, for the stubborn determination to keep everyone alive, to let no one fall, to survive together through darkness into light. Her story, though forgotten by official histories, lived on in the communities she had helped save, in the techniques that bore no name but her memory, in the quiet knowledge that survival was not a solitary achievement, but a collective act, not a triumph of the strong over the weak, but a testimony to what humans could accomplish when they chose cooperation over competition, sharing over hoarding, community over isolation. The settlement she left behind continued for generations, growing slowly, adapting to its harsh environment, incorporating the lessons she had taught into its fundamental practices. And though her name eventually faded from memory, though the specific details of her life were lost to time, the essence of what she had taught, that we survive together or not at all, that knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied, that the measure of a community is not how well the strong survive, but whether the weak survive too. These lessons persisted, woven into the fabric of how people in that remote place understood survival, understood community, understood what it meant to be human in a landscape that seemed designed to make humanity impossible. Let us drift now into a different kind of darkness, not the darkness of a winter night, but the darkness of time itself, of centuries that have buried evidence beneath layers of earth and snow and forgetting. Here, in the spaces between what we know and what we can only guess, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of winter cooking practices that puzzle and intrigue, that hint at knowledge systems we can no longer fully access, at rituals whose meanings have dissolved into the soil along with those who practiced them. The story begins, as many archaeological stories do, with an accidental discovery. In the summer of 1967, road construction crews working in the Irkutsk region broke through to a series of underground chambers that should not have been there, that appeared on no maps, that seemed to defy the usual patterns of frontier settlement architecture. The chambers were roughly circular, dug deep into the permafrost layer, their walls lined with stones that had been carefully fitted together without mortar. The roofs had long since collapsed, filled with centuries of accumulated soil and debris, but the basic structure remained intact, preserved by the very cold that had made life so difficult for their original inhabitants. What puzzled the archaeologists who arrived to document the site was not the existence of underground chambers. These were common enough in regions where winter made surface dwelling dangerous. What puzzled them was what they found inside these chambers, the artifacts that seemed to tell a story about winter cooking that didn't quite match the historical record, that suggested practices and beliefs more complex than simple survival. The floors of these chambers were covered in a thick layer of ash and charcoal, but the pattern of burning was strange. Rather than a central hearth, which would have been typical, there were multiple small fire pits arranged in a circle around the edges of the chamber, each pit carefully lined with flat stones that showed signs of extreme, repeated heating. Between these fire pits, the archaeologists found something unexpected, a series of carved stones, each about the size of a human head, polished smooth on one side and incised with patterns on the other. The patterns were geometric, spirals, concentric circles, zigzag lines, but their meaning was unclear, their purpose mysterious. Carbon dating placed the chambers somewhere in the late 17th or early 18th century, a time when Russian settlement of Siberia was still relatively new, when indigenous and settler communities existed in closer proximity, when the exchange of knowledge and practice was more fluid than it would later become. But who had built these chambers, who had used them, and most importantly, why, remained open questions. The carved stones became the focus of intense speculation. Their surfaces showed signs of extreme heat, discoloration, small cracks, a glassy quality in places where the stone had partially melted. Clearly they had been heated, had been used in some kind of cooking process. But the carvings suggested something beyond mere utility, something ritual or symbolic. The care taken in their creation spoke to hours of patient labor, to hands working by firelight or daylight, chipping and polishing until the surface achieved the desired smoothness, until the patterns emerged with sufficient clarity to convey whatever meaning they were meant to hold. One theory proposed that these were heating stones used in a sophisticated method of indirect cooking, stones that would be heated in the fire pits and then carried to the center of the chamber, where they would be placed in or near cooking vessels, providing heat without direct flame. The carvings in this interpretation might have been simple decoration, or perhaps marks of ownership, ways of distinguishing one family's stones from another's in a communal cooking space. But other archaeologists saw something more in those patterns, something that suggested ritual or spiritual significance. The spirals, they noted, appeared in indigenous art throughout the region, often associated with the sun, with cycles of time, with the journey of the soul. The concentric circles might represent the layers of reality, the seen and unseen worlds. The zigzags could symbolize lightning, or perhaps the difficult path of winter survival, or the cracking of ice, or the sharp turn of a river through frozen landscape. Metaphors encoded in geometric abstraction, meanings compressed into repeatable forms. Residue analysis of pottery fragments found in the chambers revealed traces of an unusual mixture, berries of several varieties, roots that grew in the region, grains that would have been introduced by Russian settlers, and something else, something organic but unidentifiable, something that had broken down too completely to be analyzed with the technology available in the 1960s and 70s. This mixture appeared repeatedly across different vessels, different chambers, different sites. It seemed to represent not individual meals but a specific preparation, something made deliberately, something that mattered enough to be created in the same way over and over, following a recipe or formula that had been passed down and preserved across generations. The consistency of the mixture across multiple sites suggested a shared tradition, knowledge that moved through communities either by teaching or by common origin, binding together people separated by vast distances through the repetition of this particular culinary practice. The archaeologists called it the Midwinter Brew, a placeholder name that acknowledged both their findings and their ignorance. Was it food, medicine, a ritual drink consumed during some winter ceremony? The evidence could support any of these interpretations, or perhaps all of them simultaneously. In cultures where the boundaries between nourishment, healing, and spiritual practice remain fluid, a single preparation might serve multiple functions, might be understood as simultaneously feeding the body, treating illness, and maintaining connection with forces beyond the physical realm, a convergence of purposes that our modern categorical thinking struggles to accommodate. Contemporary accounts from the period, letters from Orthodox priests, reports from government officials, journals kept by literate settlers, occasionally mention winter practices that might relate to these findings. A priest writing in 1712 complains about settlers participating in heathen ceremonies involving fire and stones during the darkest part of winter. A government inspector in 1735 notes with disapproval that Russian settlers have adopted savage customs from their indigenous neighbors, including rituals around food preparation that he considers unnecessary and possibly heretical. These glimpses, filtered through incomprehension and prejudice, nonetheless confirm that something was happening, that winter cooking involved dimensions invisible or incomprehensible to outside observers, that the official narrative of frontier life missed entire categories of experience. But these accounts are frustratingly vague, written by observers who did not participate, who viewed the practices with suspicion or contempt, who saw no need to document in detail what seemed to them simply backward superstition. They tell us that something was happening, that winter cooking involved practices beyond simple nutrition, but they don't tell us what those practices meant to the people who engaged in them. The gap between observation and understanding, between recording and comprehending, yawns wide across these historical sources. The officials and priests who wrote these accounts stood physically present at the threshold of practices they could never truly witness, too enclosed in their own frameworks of meaning to recognize the logic and necessity operating in what they dismissed as superstition or savagery. Indigenous oral traditions from Evenki and Yakut communities preserve stories about winter ceremonies that may relate to these archaeological findings. In one tale, people must feed the fire spirits during the longest nights, must offer them specially prepared food that contains something from the forest, something from the field, something from the water, something from the air, a mixing of realms, a bringing together of the world's elements to create wholeness in the midst of winter's fragmentation. Another story speaks of stones that remember warmth, that must be taught each year to hold heat, to share it slowly rather than releasing it all at once. The teaching involves marking the stones with patterns that represent warmth, that symbolize the sun's journey back toward the earth after the winter solstice, that connect the practical need for cooking heat with the spiritual need to maintain hope through darkness. These stories were collected by anthropologists in the early 20th century, written down and translated, preserved in academic journals that few people read. They exist in that liminal space between evidence and interpretation, neither purely factual nor purely mythological, containing truths that cannot be verified but that feel true in some deeper way, that resonate with the archaeological findings, even if they cannot explain them definitively. The relationship between oral tradition and physical evidence remains perpetually problematic. We cannot prove that the stories describe the practices that created the archaeological record, cannot establish direct continuity between tale and artifact, and yet the correspondences seem too numerous, too specific to dismiss as mere coincidence. Perhaps what we are seeing is not direct documentation, but rather the survival of a conceptual framework, a way of thinking about fire and stone and winter that persisted even as specific practices evolved or disappeared, that continued to shape storytelling long after the underground chambers fell into disuse. The mystery deepens when we consider other sites, other chambers, other caches of carved stones found across the Siberian frontier. In some places, the stones are inscribed with Christian symbols, crosses, stylized images of saints, mixed with the geometric patterns, suggesting a blending of traditions, a syncretism born of necessity and proximity. In other places, the stones bear symbols that archaeologists cannot identify at all, patterns that don't match known indigenous traditions or Russian customs, that seem to represent something unique, something developed in the specific conditions of the frontier, in the space where cultures met and mixed and created something new. This frontier creativity, this invention of forms and meanings adequate to unprecedented circumstances, speaks to the human capacity for cultural innovation under pressure, for synthesis and adaptation when survival demands the integration of all available knowledge regardless of its origin. One site near Lake Baikal yielded a particularly intriguing finding, a chamber similar to the others, but with walls covered in soot patterns that, when photographed and analyzed, seemed to show deliberate images. The smoke, as it rose and spread across the walls, had been somehow directed, shaped, allowed to settle in some places and not others, creating pictures that still faintly visible after centuries. The images showed human figures gathered around what appeared to be a central pot or vessel. Above them, swirling patterns might represent smoke or perhaps spirits, or perhaps simply the movement of heat through cold air. Around the edges, shapes that could be animals or could be abstract patterns formed a border, a frame for the central scene. The scale of the figures varied in ways that might indicate perspective or hierarchy, or perhaps simply the limitations of the medium. Smoke settling on stone surfaces offers less precision than paint or charcoal, requires working with indeterminacy, with patterns that emerge through accumulation rather than application. Was this art, documentation, religious imagery? The excavating team disagreed among themselves, each bringing their own interpretations to the ambiguous evidence, but all agreed on one thing: the creation of these images required deliberate effort, required someone to control the fire, to manage the smoke, to shape its deposit with tools or barriers or airflow, to create something that would last, that would communicate across time, even if its message became obscured. The technical knowledge implied by these smoke paintings suggests sophistication in understanding how fire behaves in enclosed spaces, how smoke moves and settles, how to manipulate these movements to achieve desired effects. Knowledge born of countless hours spent underground with fire, of patient observation and experimentation, of attention to phenomena that most people would simply endure without studying. The question of why haunted the researchers. Why would people who struggled simply to survive winter, who faced constant hunger and cold and the threat of death, invest time and effort in decorating underground chambers, in carving stones that would never be seen except by fellow community members, in creating smoke paintings that would slowly fade even as they were being made? Perhaps because humans are not only practical creatures concerned solely with physical survival, perhaps because even, or especially, in the most difficult circumstances we need beauty, need meaning, need ways of marking significance, of transforming mere survival into something that feels like living. The underground chambers themselves suggest this impulse toward creating space that matters, space that is not just functional shelter but something more. The effort required to dig these chambers deep into frozen ground, to line them with carefully fitted stones, to create structures that would last. This effort far exceeded what would have been necessary for simple food storage or temporary shelter. Experiments conducted by contemporary archaeologists attempting to replicate the construction process using period-appropriate tools revealed the staggering labor investment these chambers represented. Even with multiple workers, even with the ground softened by summer thaw, excavating a single chamber required weeks of sustained effort, of removing earth basket by basket, of selecting and fitting stones for the walls, of creating the careful drainage systems that prevented the chambers from flooding during spring melt. Some archaeologists have proposed that these were communal spaces, places where multiple families would gather during the worst of winter, sharing not just warmth and food, but also stories, songs, the intangible things that make isolation bearable. The circular arrangement of fire pits supports this interpretation, each family perhaps maintaining their own fire while sharing the common space, each contributing to the collective warmth while retaining some autonomy. The carved heating stones in this interpretation might have served as markers of identity, as ways of saying this is our stone, this is our contribution, this is our place in the circle. The patterns would then function as a kind of signature, a way of being recognized, of being seen as part of the community even in darkness, even when smoke and shadows obscured faces and individual identities dissolved into the collective struggle. But other evidence complicates this tidy interpretation. At some sites, single chambers contained stones with many different carving styles, suggesting either that one family used multiple stones or that the stones were somehow shared or exchanged. That ownership was less fixed than the marker theory would suggest. At other sites, stones were found, deliberately broken and buried beneath the fire pits, as if their use had ended, as if they had served their purpose and needed to be retired with some ceremony. The breaking appeared intentional, clean fractures, not the irregular shattering of stones that cracked from repeated heating, suggesting ritual destruction, the deliberate ending of an object's functional life in ways that mirror practices documented in many cultures, ways of acknowledging that objects acquire significance through use and require proper treatment when that use concludes. The question of the midwinter brew, that mysterious mixture of berries, roots, grains, and unknown organic material, adds another layer to the puzzle. If it was food prepared in a specific way for a specific purpose, not just whatever happened to be available thrown together. If it was medicine made communally in quantities that suggest group consumption rather than individual treatment. The vessels in which traces of the brew were found showed capacity for multiple servings, volumes that would feed a gathered community rather than a single household, reinforcing the interpretation of these chambers as places of collective gathering rather than family dwellings. Modern analysis using techniques unavailable to earlier researchers has provided some additional information while simultaneously deepening the mystery. The unidentified organic component appears to be fungal in nature, possibly a mushroom or lichen species. Some varieties of Arctic lichens have mild psychoactive properties when prepared correctly, though whether these were known to frontier populations remains unclear. The presence of these compounds, if confirmed, opens new interpretive possibilities. Perhaps the midwinter brew was meant to alter consciousness, to facilitate experiences understood as travel between worlds, as communication with spirits, as access to knowledge or visions unavailable in ordinary states of awareness. This finding led to inevitable speculation about shamanic practices, about altered states of consciousness, about ritual journeys undertaken during the darkest part of winter. But the evidence is ambiguous, capable of supporting multiple interpretations without definitively proving any of them. The term shamanic itself carries problematic baggage, importing frameworks from anthropological study of Siberian indigenous cultures and applying them to practices that may have emerged from entirely different traditions, or from novel syntheses that combined elements in ways that fit no existing category. We must be cautious about imposing explanatory frameworks that feel familiar but may fundamentally misrepresent what was actually happening in these underground chambers. What we can say with confidence is that winter cooking on the Siberian frontier involved practices that went beyond simple nutrition, that incorporated elements we might call spiritual or ritual or ceremonial. The carved stones, the underground chambers, the smoke paintings, the carefully prepared brew. All of these suggest that eating in winter was not just about filling stomachs, but about maintaining community, about marking time, about creating meaning in the face of hardship. The investment of labor, the attention to aesthetic detail, the careful repetition of specific procedures across multiple sites, and presumably across years, all of this speaks to practices embedded in systems of meaning, to actions understood as necessary, not just for physical survival, but for maintaining proper relationships with the world, with the forces that govern survival, with whatever powers were believed to hold authority over the success or failure of human endeavors in winter's extremity. There is something profoundly moving about these archaeological traces, something that speaks across the centuries about the human need to make beauty even in darkness, to create ritual even in crisis, to invest the simple act of preparing food with significance beyond mere survival. These unknown people, struggling through winters we can barely imagine, found time and energy to carve patterns into stones, to arrange fire pits in meaningful configurations, to prepare special mixtures according to recipes that mattered enough to be preserved and repeated. The stones themselves, held in museum cases now, still carry the weight of that effort, still bear witness to hands that shaped them, to intentions we can no longer access, but can still recognize as intention, as purposeful action aimed at creating something that mattered, that meant something within a framework of meaning that has not survived into our time, but that was once as real and necessary as any truth we hold today. The mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps it is appropriate that these practices, developed in response to conditions we no longer experience, carried out by people whose names have been lost, should remain partially obscured, partially unknowable. We can see the evidence they left behind, can hold the stones they carved, can stand in the chambers they dug, but we cannot fully access the meanings they created, the experiences they had, the understanding that allowed them to face winter, not just as something to be endured, but as something that could be met with ritual, with art, with the deliberate creation of significance. Our distance from their experience is not merely temporal, but epistemological. We lack not just information, but the entire conceptual apparatus that would make that information comprehensible, that would allow us to think thoughts structured by their assumptions rather than our own. Modern recreations of these underground chambers, built by experimental archaeologists trying to understand how they functioned, have revealed some practical insights. The circular arrangement of fire pits does create a remarkably even distribution of heat, better than a single central fire. The deep underground construction provides excellent insulation, and the stone-lined walls absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. Measurements taken during these experiments showed temperature differentials significantly smaller than in surface structures, creating environments where the extremes of cold were substantially moderated, where human bodies could function without the constant drain of fighting severe cold, where the physiological cost of winter survival decreased enough to allow attention to activities beyond mere temperature maintenance. But the recreations also revealed something else. The space feels different from ordinary dwellings, feels somehow set apart, special. The act of descending into the earth, of entering this carved-out chamber, lit by multiple small fires, of sitting in a circle with others while smoke rises overhead. This creates an experience that is not quite ordinary life, that feels somewhere between the everyday and the ceremonial. The quality of light underground differs fundamentally from surface illumination. Firelight reflects from stone walls in ways that create movement, that make shadows dance, that transform the space into something alive, something responsive to the fires that define it. The acoustic properties also differ. Sound behaves strangely in these chambers. voices taking on qualities they lack in open air, creating sonic environments that might enhance the sense of being in liminal space, in a place between worlds rather than fully in the ordinary realm of daily existence. Perhaps this was the point, to create space where winter survival could be combined with something more, where the practical need to cook and share warmth could be joined with the psychological need for ritual, for gathering, for shared experience that transcended individual suffering. Perhaps the carved stones were not just heating implements, but also sacred objects, both, and rather than either or, serving dual purposes in a worldview that did not sharply separate the practical from the spiritual. This integration of function and meaning, of utility and significance, characterizes many traditional practices that modernity has fragmented into separate domains. We cook here, worship there, never imagining that these activities might once have been understood as aspects of a single continuous reality, as different expressions of the same fundamental relationship between humans and the forces that sustain or threaten life. The patterns carved into the stones, those spirals and circles and zigzags, appear throughout human cultures, across time and geography, suggesting that they tap into something fundamental, something deeply human. Carl Jung would have called them archetypal images, symbols that arise from the collective unconscious, that speak to universal human experiences and needs. In the context of winter survival, these patterns take on specific resonances. The spiral might represent the turning of seasons, the slow movement from darkness toward light, the journey that winter requires, inward, downward, through cold, toward eventual warmth. The concentric circles might symbolize layers of insulation, the many barriers between warmth and cold, the nested spaces of shelter within shelter that winter survival demands. The zigzag could represent the path through winter, never straight, always requiring adjustment and navigation, moving between crisis and stability, hunger and sufficiency, cold and warmth. But these are modern interpretations, projections of our meanings onto symbols whose original significance has been lost. The people who carved these stones knew what they meant, knew what they intended, knew what significance these patterns carried within their community and their time. We can only guess, only imagine, only project our own understanding onto these silent artifacts that speak volumes while saying nothing definite. The humility required to acknowledge this limitation, to recognize that we are interpreting rather than reading, that we are constructing meaning rather than recovering it, comes hard to disciplines trained to extract truth from evidence, to speak with authority about the past, but it represents the only honest response to mysteries that refuse to resolve into certainty. The smoke paintings on chamber walls present a similar interpretive challenge. The figures gathered around a central vessel, are they family members sharing a meal, participants in a ceremony, spirits or ancestors invoked during winter rituals? The swirling patterns above them, smoke rising from the fire, spirits ascending, the breath of the living visible in cold air. Each interpretation feels plausible, and perhaps the ambiguity was intentional. Perhaps the images were meant to hold multiple meanings simultaneously, to function differently depending on who viewed them and in what context. Art created by and for a community does not need to explain itself, does not need to choose a single definitive meaning, can remain comfortably ambiguous because everyone present shares the cultural context that makes the images meaningful. We, standing outside that context, separated by centuries and cultural transformation, can see the images but cannot fully access their meaning. We are like people looking at words in a language we don't speak. We can see that they are words, can recognize that they convey meaning, but cannot read them, cannot extract the message they contain. The comparison to language illuminates the nature of our interpretive predicament. We possess the material signifiers but lack access to the systems of signification that would render them intelligible, that would transform marks on stone from visual phenomena into conveyors of specific, intended meanings. Without the grammar and vocabulary of the culture that produced these images, we can appreciate them aesthetically, can recognize their intentionality, but cannot read them in the sense of extracting the particular messages their creators meant to encode. This is the fundamental frustration and fascination of archaeology. We can touch what others touched, can hold what they held, can stand where they stood, but we cannot think what they thought, cannot feel what they felt, cannot fully inhabit their world, no matter how carefully we reconstruct it. The material record preserves only a fraction of human experience, privileging the durable over the ephemeral, the stone and ceramic over the wood and fiber, the objects over the relationships, the products over the processes. And yet there is something valuable in the attempt, something important in acknowledging the limits of our understanding while still engaging with the evidence, still trying to imagine lives vastly different from our own, still respecting the complexity and richness of human experience across time and culture. The effort to understand, even when complete understanding remains impossible, represents a kind of respect, an acknowledgement that these past lives matter, that their struggles and solutions and meanings deserve attention, even when they resist our attempts at comprehension. The people who built these chambers, who carved these stones, who prepared the midwinter brew according to recipes we can no longer fully reconstruct, they lived and struggled and found ways to make their struggle meaningful. They faced winters that tested the limits of human endurance and responded not just with practical survival strategies, but with art, with ritual, with the creation of communal spaces and shared practices that transformed survival into something more than mere continuation. Their specific meanings may be lost, their particular understandings may have dissolved into time, but the fact of their effort remains, the evidence of their creativity and resilience and profound humanity persists in the archaeological record, in the chambers they dug and the stones they carved and the patterns they made with smoke on underground walls. This persistence of evidence in the absence of explanation creates a particular kind of knowledge. We know that meaning existed, that significance was created and maintained, that human consciousness engaged with winter through frameworks sophisticated enough to require material expression, even if we cannot recover the specific content of that meaning. Perhaps that is enough, not to know everything, not to solve every mystery, but to recognize that these mysteries existed, that these people lived and created meaning in circumstances we can barely imagine, that winter cooking was never just about calories and warmth, but always also about community and significance, and the stubborn human insistence on creating beauty, even in darkness, on maintaining ritual, even in crisis, on being fully human, even when survival demands everything we have. The recognition itself constitutes a kind of relationship across time, a connection that does not require complete understanding, that can exist in the space of acknowledged mystery, of respected difference, of curiosity that remains humble about its own limitations. The carved stones rest now in museum collections, labeled and catalogued, removed from their original context, but preserved for study and contemplation. The chambers have been backfilled or left exposed, some maintained as archaeological sites where researchers continue to search for answers, others abandoned to the slow process of natural decay, returning to the earth from which they were carved. The transformation from lived space to archaeological site, from functioning element of cultural practice to object of scholarly investigation, represents a kind of death and rebirth. The original meanings die, but the objects gain new existence as evidence, as puzzles, as windows into vanished ways of being human. Museums become strange afterlives for these artifacts, spaces where they persist beyond their original purposes, where they communicate in ways their makers never intended, to audiences who bring entirely different questions and concerns to the encounter. But the questions remain, suspended in the space between evidence and interpretation, between what we can prove and what we can only imagine. What did the patterns mean? Why were the stones carved? What was in the brew? And what did consuming it signify? Why go underground? Why arrange fires in circles? Why create smoke paintings that would slowly fade? Each question opens onto others, creating networks of unknowing constellations of mystery that resist collapse into singular explanations that seem to demand multiple simultaneous answers, or perhaps answers that exist in frameworks our thought cannot accommodate. We may never answer these questions definitively, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, to remind us of the limits of our knowledge, to humble us with the recognition that vast areas of human experience remain inaccessible, that we are separated from our ancestors by more than just time, that the dead keep their secrets even as they leave behind traces of their lives. The comfort we might take in complete knowledge, in solved mysteries, in confident explanations, gives way to something more complex. The recognition that human history contains irretrievable losses, that much of what mattered most to people who came before has vanished beyond recovery, that our reconstructions of the past remain always partial, always provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges or new interpretive frameworks develop. In the end, what these archaeological mysteries tell us most clearly is this: that winter survival in the Siberian frontier involved practices richer and more complex than we might have imagined, that even in extremity, humans create meaning, that cooking and eating were never merely practical activities, but always also opportunities for art, for ritual, for the expression of values and beliefs that transcended immediate survival needs. The convergence of necessity and meaning in these underground chambers reminds us that the human animal is peculiar in its inability to simply survive, in its need to make survival mean something, to embed even the most basic activities in networks of significance that transform actions into practices, into traditions, into expressions of what it means to be human in specific times and places. The mystery of winter's kitchen remains unsolved, but in its unsolved state, it speaks to something profound about human nature, about our capacity to face hardship with creativity, to meet darkness with light, literal light in the form of fire, but also metaphorical light in the form of meaning, of beauty, of communal bonds that make survival not just possible, but worthwhile. The underground chambers, with their circle of fires and their carved stones and their smoke-painted walls, stand as monuments to this capacity, as evidence that humans have always been more than merely practical creatures, that we have always required beauty and meaning and connection, even or especially when circumstances seem to permit only the barest survival. As we stand in these excavated chambers now, or study the carved stones in museums, or read the tentative interpretations in archaeological reports, we participate in a strange continuity. We too are humans facing our own forms of darkness, our own winters, literal and metaphorical, seeking ways to create meaning in the face of forces that threaten to reduce us to mere survival. The people who carved these stones are gone, their names forgotten, their languages silent, their beliefs dissolved, but their insistence on creating beauty in darkness persists, speaks across the centuries, reminds us that we are not the first to face the question of how to remain human when conditions demand everything we have. Perhaps this is what the carved stones really mean, what the underground chambers ultimately signify, not any specific belief or practice, but the fundamental human commitment to making life meaningful even in extremity, to creating beauty even in darkness, to maintaining community and ritual and art even when survival itself hangs in the balance. If so, then the specific interpretations matter less than the recognition of this commitment, less than the acknowledgement that we inherit from these unknown ancestors, not just their DNA, but their determination to be fully human, regardless of circumstance, to face winter not just as something to be endured, but as something that can be met with creativity, with ritual, with the stubborn creation of meaning that transforms survival into living. Let us climb now from the underground chambers of mystery into a different kind of space, into rooms that glow with lamplight, where ceramic stoves radiate steady warmth, where tables hold more than thin broth and survival cakes. Here, in the small towns and administrative centers scattered across the Siberian frontier, a different winter unfolded, not comfortable by the standards of Moscow or St. Petersburg, not luxurious by any measure, but vastly different from the desperate cold of the settlements we have inhabited until now. The contrast was not absolute, the division not clean. These were not two separate worlds, but rather points on a spectrum, with many gradations between the starving settler and the well-fed merchant. But the differences mattered, shaped experience, determined who survived winter with relative ease and who struggled for every calorie, every moment of warmth. In the town of Irkutsk in the winter of 1820, a merchant named Pavel Dmitrievich Volkov lived in a house that would have seemed palatial to someone like Anya Morozova, though Volkov himself considered it modest, barely adequate to his station. The house was 2 stories, built of thick logs with proper joinery, the gaps between them sealed with moss and clay, and then covered with boards for extra insulation. The heart of the house was its pech, a massive ceramic stove that stood taller than a man, built of brick and tile, and designed by craftsmen who understood how to make heat last. The stove was fed from the kitchen, but radiated warmth into multiple rooms, its mass absorbing heat during the hours when fire burned hottest and releasing it slowly through the long night. Volkov's kitchen was a space that would have been unimaginable to most frontier settlers. Shelves lined with pottery and copper vessels, a large work table, multiple storage areas, a separate pantry where supplies could be kept organized and accessible. Light came from oil lamps and candles, abundant enough that work could continue well into the evening. That darkness was a choice rather than an inevitability. The winter stores in Volkov's household were maintained by servants, a cook, a housekeeper, 2 young women who helped with daily work. The cellars beneath the house were extensive, subdivided into sections for different types of storage, each area maintained at the optimal temperature and humidity for what it contained. Here, grain was stored in wooden bins that kept it dry and free from pests. Root vegetables rested in sand-filled crates, each layer separated to prevent rot from spreading. Preserved meats hung from hooks in a cold room that stayed just above freezing, cold enough to preserve, but not so cold as to freeze solid. The variety was what separated elite tables from common ones, not just turnips and grain, but also imported goods that arrived in summer caravans and were carefully rationed through winter. Sugar, dark and grainy but recognizably sweet. Tea from China, compressed into bricks that would be shaved off a bit at a time. Dried fruits from warmer regions, apricots, raisins, even occasionally figs or dates from trading routes that stretched back to Central Asia. Volkov's breakfast in winter bore little resemblance to the thin soup and hard bread that sustained ordinary settlers. He awoke to a room that was cool but not freezing, where the petch had maintained enough residual warmth through the night that dressing was merely uncomfortable rather than agonizing. A servant had already risen earlier, had fed the stove, had begun preparing the morning meal. By the time Volkov descended to his dining room, tea was ready, proper tea, black and strong, served with sugar and cream that had been kept from freezing in the warmest part of the cellar. There was porridge made from fine milled grain, cooked slowly to a smooth consistency, sweetened with honey that had been stored in sealed clay pots since autumn. There was bread, still warm from the oven, made with wheat flour rather than the coarse rye that was all most people could afford, soft and light and spread with butter that had been preserved in brine. On special occasions there might be jam made from berries gathered in summer, or pickled vegetables that added brightness to the heavy winter diet, or even occasionally fresh eggs from chickens that were kept warm enough to continue laying through winter. A luxury that required dedicated space and resources most could not spare. Volkov ate his breakfast while reading correspondence that had arrived before the worst of winter closed the roads, while planning the business he would conduct once spring made travel possible again. His wife joined him, her own breakfast identical to his, their children eventually appearing from the upper floor where they slept in beds piled with quilts and furs. The contrast with settler life was stark. Where settlers faced each morning with anxiety about dwindling supplies, Volkov's primary concern was maintaining the quality and variety of his family's diet. Where settlers calculated how little they could eat and still function, Volkov's household worried about preventing waste, about consuming perishable items before they spoiled despite the cold. But the elite winter experience was not uniform, not identical across all who had resources. The quality of winter life depended on multiple factors: the size of one's household, the efficiency of one's storage systems, the quality of one's dwelling, and perhaps most importantly, one's position in the complex social hierarchies of frontier towns. Government officials lived well when their positions were secure, when their salaries arrived on time, when the supply chains that brought goods to remote outposts functioned as intended. A district administrator might have access to resources that rivaled those of successful merchants: adequate housing, sufficient stores, servants to manage the daily work of winter survival. But officials also faced particular vulnerabilities. Political changes in distant capitals could end careers abruptly, could transform comfort into crisis. Supply caravans meant for official use might be diverted or delayed, might never arrive at all, leaving those who depended on them scrambling to acquire food through the same local markets where prices rose sharply as winter progressed. The Orthodox clergy occupied an ambiguous position in frontier hierarchies, respected for their spiritual role, often educated beyond the average settler, but not necessarily wealthy, not necessarily comfortable. A parish priest in a small town might live better than his congregation, but worse than merchants or officials, caught between worlds, expected to maintain certain standards on resources that barely allowed for adequacy. Father Andrei, serving a church in a settlement not far from where Anya Morozova lived, experienced winter in ways that mixed elements of both elite and common life. His dwelling was attached to the church, better constructed than most houses, with a stove that functioned properly, with enough space for his wife and 4 children. The parish was expected to support him, and they did, but support from struggling settlers meant receiving contributions of food when people could barely feed themselves. Father Andrei's stores were better than most of his parishioners, but not abundant, not secure, not free from the anxiety that accompanied every winter. His mornings began with prayer in a church so cold his breath froze as he spoke, where the icons seemed to stare from walls that radiated chill, where even the incense seemed reluctant to burn in air that felt hostile to warmth. After prayer, he returned to his dwelling for breakfast, better than most, but recognizably related to the meals of common settlers: porridge, bread, tea, if they had it, broth made from whatever the parish had contributed. Father Andrei's position required him to maintain certain appearances, to represent stability and comfort even when his own resources stretched thin. He was expected to offer hospitality to travelers, to feed the desperate when they appeared at his door, to exemplify Christian charity in circumstances where charity could mean endangering his own family's survival. The tension between religious duty and practical necessity weighed on him constantly. How much should he give away when his own children looked at him with hungry eyes? How could he preach about God's providence while watching his parishioners slowly starve? What did faith mean in the face of winter's brutal indifference to prayer and virtue? His wife, Matryona, managed their household with skills that rivaled those of any settler woman. She preserved, rationed, stretched, improvised, making their stores last through techniques learned from her mother and from the women of the parish, who shared knowledge freely because everyone understood that survival was collective or it was nothing. But Matryona also had advantages that settler women lacked. She was literate, could read recipes and preservation instructions from books, could correspond with relatives in more settled regions who sent advice and occasionally small packages of goods. She had better tools, better storage containers, a stove that maintained consistent heat for cooking, rather than the smoky, unreliable fires that most people managed. The elite tables of winter were not always elite in the sense of abundant or luxurious. They were elite primarily in their reliability, their predictability, their freedom from the constant anxiety that characterized settler life. The difference between comfort and desperation was not always vast in terms of actual calories, but the psychological distance was enormous. Merchant families like the Volkovs lived with the assumption that winter would be survived, that spring would arrive with their household intact, that the primary questions were about maintaining quality of life rather than life itself. This assumption, more than any particular abundance, defined elite experience, separated it from the grinding uncertainty that characterized common life. But even elite winters carried vulnerabilities, carried reminders that comfort was conditional, that the distance between security and crisis could collapse suddenly. Volkov's wealth depended on summer trade, on caravans that crossed vast distances, on markets that functioned, on political stability that allowed commerce to continue. A particularly severe winter could disrupt these systems even for the wealthy. If roads remained impassable longer than usual, if spring came late, if supplies couldn't be replenished before next winter arrived, even merchant households could find their stores inadequate, their security revealed as an illusion. The winter of 1837 brought this reality home to frontier elites in ways that erased some of the comfortable distinctions between their experience and that of common settlers. That year, an administrative crisis in Irkutsk led to the delayed departure of the annual supply caravan, which then encountered early winter weather that forced it to stop halfway to its destination. The supplies meant for the town's elite households, imported tea, sugar, fine flour, preserved meats, sat frozen in a camp several hundred miles away, guarded by men who were themselves slowly starving, slowly freezing, slowly coming to terms with the fact that they might not survive to deliver their cargo. In Irkutsk, the families who had expected these supplies found themselves in the unfamiliar position of needing to ration, to improvise, to acquire food through local sources that were already strained by the needs of the common population. The merchants and officials who had lived through previous winters in comfort suddenly understood what settlers faced every year: the calculation of insufficient resources against too many weeks of cold, the anxiety of watching stores diminish, the humbling experience of hunger. Volkov found himself visiting the same market where his cook usually purchased supplementary supplies, but now the market was nearly empty, the few goods available priced beyond reason. The local grain supply, which had seemed adequate at winter's start, was revealed as barely sufficient for the existing population. Adding the demand from elite households who could no longer rely on imported goods strained the system past its capacity. For the first time in his adult life, Volkov experienced real hunger. Not the aesthetic appreciation of a delayed meal, not the temporary discomfort of a busy day, but the hollow, persistent sensation that nothing would quite fill, that food was something to be anxious about rather than something to be assumed. His children, who had always eaten well, who had grown up healthy and strong, began to show the signs Volkov had seen in poorer children but had never expected to see in his own: the thinning of limbs, the prominence of bones, the listlessness that came from insufficient nutrition. The experience was educational in ways that prosperity never could have been. Volkov learned what his cook had always known, that food preservation was skilled work, that making supplies last required knowledge and attention. He learned what settlers understood intimately, that winter was democratic in its cruelty, that cold and hunger cared nothing for social position, that the distance between comfort and desperation was smaller than he had imagined. The crisis passed when spring came early that year, when the supply caravan was able to resume its journey, when trade routes reopened and goods began flowing again. But the memory persisted, a reminder that elite status was contingent, that the structures that supported comfort could fail, that everyone in the frontier was vulnerable in ways that civilized life in warmer, more settled regions made it easy to forget. The experience changed some people. Volkov became more generous with local families, more willing to share resources, more aware that his survival was tied to the community's survival, that isolation and hoarding were strategies that worked only until they didn't. Others drew different lessons, that one could never have enough stores, that security required even greater accumulation, that the solution to vulnerability was not solidarity, but further insulation from the common fate. Father Andrei, observing these changes in his parish and town, found in them a kind of vindication of his faith's teachings. The wealthy learning humility, the poor learning dignity in their struggles, the community drawing together in crisis. These were patterns he recognized from Scripture, from saints' lives, from the moral architecture of Christianity. But he also saw the limits of faith in the face of winter's material realities. Prayer did not fill empty cellars, piety did not keep fires burning, virtue did not prevent frost or starvation. The practical knowledge that women like Anya Morozova and Matriona possessed, the skills of preservation and preparation and improvisation, these mattered as much as spiritual wisdom, perhaps more, when survival was at stake. The tension between spiritual and material concerns occupied much of Father Andrei's thinking during winter months. His faith taught that this world was temporary, that suffering had meaning, that salvation was more important than comfort. But watching children go hungry, watching families struggle, watching the slow erosion of health and hope that winter brought, these experiences made abstract theology feel inadequate, made him question what faith meant if it didn't address material need. He found himself drawn to the stories of saints who had fed the hungry, who had performed miracles of multiplication, who had transformed scarcity into abundance through divine intervention. But miracles didn't come to the frontier, or if they did, they took the form of human effort, the careful preservation that made food last, the shared knowledge that helped communities survive, the collective action that distributed scarce resources according to need rather than ability to pay. The winter rituals of elite households contained their own forms of meaning-making, their own ways of marking time and creating significance. In merchant homes, the Christmas feast was elaborate by frontier standards. Multiple courses, imported delicacies, abundance that seemed almost obscene in the context of winter scarcity. But that felt necessary, that represented the assertion of civilization in the midst of wilderness, of human flourishing despite the cold. These feasts were partially about the food itself, but more importantly, about what the food represented: connection to distant places, participation in cultural traditions that spanned the empire, the maintenance of identity and status, even in remote outposts. The imported sugar and tea, the fine cloth on the table, the proper serving vessels, these signaled belonging to a broader world, resistance to the isolation that winter threatened. But the feasts also created discomfort, awareness of contrast, guilt that could not be entirely suppressed. Through the windows of warm houses where abundant food was being consumed, the dark town was visible, the snow-covered streets, the smaller dwellings where families huddled around inadequate fires and ate inadequate meals. The proximity of suffering to comfort made both more visible, made it impossible to fully enjoy abundance without awareness of others' want. Some families responded to this discomfort through charity, distributing food to the poor after church services, hiring extra servants who would be fed as part of their employment, supporting the church in its work of providing minimal assistance to the desperate. These actions were simultaneously genuine expressions of concern and ways of managing guilt, of creating moral distance between oneself and the suffering that surrounded elite comfort. Father Andre's Christmas sermon addressed this tension directly, speaking about the meaning of Christ's birth in poverty, about God choosing to enter the world through the lowest rather than the highest, about the spiritual danger of wealth and the spiritual virtue of poverty. His words were crafted carefully, criticizing without alienating, comforting without condoning, trying to navigate between the demands of faith and the realities of social hierarchy. The wealthy merchants in their best clothes listened with varying degrees of attention and conviction. Some felt convicted, resolved to do better, to share more generously. Others felt judged, resented the implication that their comfort was somehow problematic, that they should feel guilty for succeeding where others struggled. Still others barely heard the sermon at all, distracted by cold feet despite warm clothing, by thoughts of the feast waiting at home, by the endless calculations of business and survival that occupied their minds constantly. The social structure of frontier towns in winter was complex and fluid. Hierarchies existed but were constantly negotiated, constantly tested by the material realities of winter survival. A merchant's wealth mattered less when caravans couldn't move, when money couldn't purchase goods that didn't exist. An official's authority meant little when administrative chains were frozen, along with the rivers that served as summer roads. What mattered most in winter was access to resources and the knowledge of how to use them. This created opportunities for women to exercise influence that exceeded their formal status. Someone like Matriona, wife of a priest, and therefore respectable but not wealthy, could wield significant informal power through her knowledge of preservation and preparation, through her ability to advise others, through the networks of women who shared skills and information. The gender dynamics of winter survival created interesting contrasts with summer's social patterns. In warmer months, men's work, hunting, trading, building, official administration defined status and power. But in winter, when men's outdoor activities were limited by cold, when survival depended more on managing stores than on acquiring new resources, women's domestic work became central, became obviously essential in ways that society's formal hierarchies didn't always acknowledge. Elite women in frontier towns occupied a space between privilege and constraint. They had resources that common women lacked, servants to help with work, better tools and facilities, access to education and information. But they also faced expectations that limited their freedom. They were expected to maintain certain standards of behavior and appearance, to represent their husband's status, to manage households according to norms imported from more civilized regions. Anna Petrovna Volkova, Pavel's wife, spent her winter days supervising servants, managing stores, receiving guests, doing needlework, reading when time and light permitted. Her life was comfortable but constrained, shaped by conventions that defined what elite women could do, where they could go, how they should spend their time. She found herself envious sometimes of the women she saw in the market, the settlers and townswomen who seemed to move more freely, who spoke more plainly, who laughed more readily despite their obvious poverty. Their lives were harder materially, but seemed less restricted socially, more authentic somehow, less burdened by the need to constantly perform respectability. This was a romanticization, Anna knew, a grass-is-greener fantasy born of her own dissatisfactions. The settler women she envied would have traded places with her instantly, would have chosen her comfortable house and reliable food over their freedom from social constraint. But the envy persisted anyway, a low-level discontent that winter's isolation and monotony intensified. The monotony was perhaps the greatest challenge of elite winter life, not hunger, not cold exactly, but boredom. The endless repetition of days that blurred together, the limitation of activity and stimulation, the sense of being trapped in a space that was comfortable but confining. Elite households tried to combat this through various strategies. Reading circles where books and letters from distant places were shared and discussed. musical evenings where those with instruments played for small gatherings, card games and chess that filled the long dark hours with structured activity. But these diversions could not entirely overcome the fundamental reality of winter, that it was a time of waiting, of suspension, of life reduced to maintenance mode, of enduring rather than living fully. The difference between elite and common experience was that elites endured in comfort while commoners endured in privation, but both were ultimately enduring, both were essentially paused, waiting for spring to release them back into motion. The vulnerability of elite comfort became most apparent not in moments of total crisis, but in small failures, small disruptions that revealed the complex systems required to maintain their lifestyle. A servant falling ill meant work undone, meals delayed, standards slipping. A storage area flooding meant scrambling to save supplies, meant losses that affected diet quality, if not survival itself. A stove developing cracks meant losing heat efficiency, meant rooms becoming uncomfortably cold, even if not dangerously so. These small failures reminded elite households that they too lived in winter's grip, that they too were subject to forces beyond their control, that their comfort was maintained through constant effort and attention, that it could not simply be assumed but had to be actively sustained through knowledge and work, and resources that could fail or prove insufficient. The spring thaw brought relief to elite households just as it did to common ones, though the relief was qualitatively different. For settlers, spring meant survival confirmed, crisis past, the most basic affirmation of continued life. For elites, spring meant restoration of variety and comfort, release from monotony, reconnection with the broader world through resumed trade and travel. But spring also brought reckoning. Stores that had been managed carefully through winter needed to be assessed for what remained, what had spoiled, what needed to be replaced before the next winter cycle began. Houses that had been closed up and heated needed to be aired and cleaned, damage from cold and moisture needed to be repaired. For some elite households, the transition to spring revealed that their winter had been less comfortable than they had maintained, that they had been quietly struggling, that the performance of comfort had hidden anxieties and privations they hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The relief of spring allowed these hidden struggles to surface, to be acknowledged now that the danger had passed. For others, spring brought guilt, the recognition that their comfort had been sustained while neighbors struggled, that they had survived winter well while others barely survived at all. This guilt could motivate charity and reform, or it could motivate forgetting, a turning away from uncomfortable realities back toward the comfortable assumption that the social order was natural, that inequality was inevitable, that their privilege was deserved rather than contingent. The frontier elite's relationship to winter was thus complex and contradictory. They lived better than common settlers, but not without anxiety. They had more resources, but also more to lose. They experienced comfort that could evaporate, status that could collapse, security that was always provisional, always dependent on systems and structures that winter tested relentlessly. In the end, the warm tables of winter were sustained not by any inherent superiority or virtue, but by access to resources, by knowledge systems, by social positions that granted advantage, by the labor of servants and the work of women, by supply chains that functioned and storage systems that held, by the small miracle of accumulated capability that made comfort possible in circumstances that made comfort fragile. The distance between elite and common experience was real, was significant, was literally the difference between comfortable survival and desperate struggle, but it was also smaller than either group often recognized, more contingent than secure elites wanted to believe, more crossable than the formal hierarchies suggested. Winter reminded everyone, regardless of status, that they lived in a harsh place, that survival was never guaranteed, that the cold was democratic even if society was not, that the distance between comfort and crisis could collapse in a single season of bad luck or poor planning or administrative failure. This was perhaps winter's greatest lesson, that human societies create hierarchies and inequalities, but nature remains indifferent to these creations, that cold and hunger afflict rich and poor alike when systems fail, that the ultimate vulnerability is shared even when the daily experience of that vulnerability differs dramatically based on one's position in social structures that winter tested and sometimes shattered. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through winter's frozen kitchens, through the dim dwellings where survival was negotiated meal by meal, through the lives of those who faced cold with nothing but skill and determination and the stubborn refusal to surrender. We have walked through darkness that lasted months, through hunger that never quite disappeared, through the daily repetition of small struggles that added up to something remarkable. The simple continuation of life in circumstances that seemed designed to extinguish it. Think for a moment about where we have been together. We began in that cold morning darkness, reviving a fire that had nearly died, preparing a breakfast that barely deserved the name, facing a day that would be much like yesterday and much like tomorrow, defined by cold and scarcity and the endless work of staying alive. We sat at that rough table, ate that thin soup, felt the inadequacy of every meal, understood in our bodies what it meant to be perpetually hungry, perpetually cold, perpetually anxious about stores that diminished no matter how carefully they were rationed. We knew the weight of winter in our bones, felt it in the weakness that came without warning, saw it in the hollow eyes of children who deserved better than what could be provided. Then we met Anya Morozova, that composite figure who represents thousands of women whose names were never recorded, but whose work sustained communities through impossible seasons. We watched her transform scarcity into sufficiency through knowledge and generosity, watched her organize collective survival when individual survival seemed impossible, watched her give until her own family went hungry, watched her become the keeper of warmth, not through any supernatural power, but through the very human capacity for care and skill and determination. Her story reminded us that winter survival was never just individual struggle, but always also collective effort, that the hearth that mattered most was not in any single dwelling, but in the connections between people, in the knowledge shared freely, in the resources distributed according to need rather than according to wealth or status. She showed us that survival had a moral dimension, that how people survived mattered as much as whether they survived, that communities could face crisis with either selfishness or solidarity, and that the choice between these paths determined not just who lived, but what kind of life was worth living. Then we descended into mystery, into the underground chambers where archaeology reveals practices we can see but cannot fully understand, where carved stones and smoke paintings speak across centuries in a language we have partially forgotten. We stood in those circular spaces, imagined the fires burning in their careful arrangement, tried to comprehend what it meant to people who struggled for every calorie to nevertheless invest time and effort in creating beauty, in marking significance, in transforming the practical work of cooking into something that also carried ritual meaning. Those mysteries reminded us that humans are never just practical creatures concerned only with survival. Even in extremity, perhaps especially in extremity, we create meaning, we make art, we perform rituals that connect us to something larger than our immediate circumstances. The people who carved those stones and arranged those fires and prepared that mysterious midwinter brew were not just trying to survive, they were trying to live, to maintain their humanity, to assert that they were more than just bodies that needed feeding, that they were beings who created significance, even in darkness. Finally, we climbed from the underground chambers into the warmer spaces of elite life, saw how winter was experienced differently depending on one's resources and position, understood that comfort was real but also fragile, that the distance between security and crisis was smaller than those who enjoyed comfort often realized. We saw how winter tested social hierarchies, how it sometimes reinforced inequalities and sometimes exposed their contingency, how it reminded everyone that nature was indifferent to human distinctions, that cold and hunger could reach anyone when systems failed. The contrast between elite and common experience taught us that winter was both universal and particular. Everyone faced it, but not everyone faced it equally. Not everyone had the same resources to meet it. Not everyone survived it with the same damage or emerged from it with the same relief. The moral complexity of this inequality remains unresolved, continues to echo through history into our own time, reminds us that how societies distribute resources and organize survival remains a choice, not an inevitability. Now, as we prepare to leave this winter world behind to return to our own time and place, it is worth reflecting on the distance we have traveled, not just through this story, but through history itself. The winters we have inhabited together were real, were experienced by real people, shaped real lives, demanded real courage and ingenuity and endurance. But they are past now, our history, our experiences that no one living will ever have to endure in quite the same way. The specific hardships of frontier winter survival have faded into memory and archive, preserved in archaeological traces and historical documents, and the stories passed down through generations until they became something else. Not lived experience, but cultural memory. Not present danger, but past struggle that shapes how descendants understand themselves and their history. You, listening to this now, in whatever time and place you inhabit, live in a world profoundly different from the one we have visited. Your winters, if you experience winter at all, are mediated by technologies and infrastructures that would have seemed miraculous to frontier settlers. You can adjust the temperature of your environment with the touch of a button, can access food from around the world regardless of season, can communicate instantly across distances that once took months to traverse. The struggles we have described, the anxiety about stores lasting through winter, the constant cold, the hunger that shaped every day, the isolation that made communities islands unto themselves, these are foreign to most modern experience, are hardships that development and technology have largely eliminated, at least for those fortunate enough to live in places where infrastructure functions and resources are adequate. This is worth celebrating, worth acknowledging as genuine progress, as real improvement in human life. The elimination of the specific sufferings we have described represents an achievement, a victory over circumstances that once seemed unchangeable, that once killed people regularly, that once made every winter a crisis to be survived rather than a season to be enjoyed. But there is also something to be learned from these old struggles, something that remains relevant even when the specific circumstances have changed. The people we have visited understood things about survival that comfortable modern life can obscure. They understood that resources are finite, that communities matter, that knowledge passed between generations is valuable, that skill in managing scarcity is worth cultivating even in times of plenty. They understood that comfort is not automatic, that it requires maintenance and attention, that systems can fail, that preparation matters, that the distance between sufficiency and crisis can collapse more quickly than we like to imagine. These lessons, learned in the context of frontier winter survival, have broader application, remain relevant in a world that faces different but equally serious challenges. More than specific lessons, though, what these winter stories offer is perspective, a reminder of what humans can endure, of what we can accomplish through cooperation and knowledge, of how we create meaning and maintain dignity even in circumstances that seem designed to break us. The struggles were real and terrible, but so was the resilience, so was the ingenuity, so was the capacity for care and community, and the stubborn insistence on remaining fully human, even when survival demanded everything. As you drift now towards sleep, as this story releases its hold on your attention, Let yourself feel gratitude for the warmth around you, for the food security you likely enjoy, for the infrastructure and technology that make your winter, if you experience winter at all, so different from the winters we have visited together. Let yourself appreciate the distance between past hardship and present comfort, between the struggles of ancestors and the relative ease of contemporary life. But also carry forward some small appreciation for those who struggled, for the Anya Morozovas and Father Andreas and anonymous settlers who faced winter with nothing but skill and determination, who preserved knowledge and shared resources, who kept fires burning and communities functioning through months of darkness and cold. Their struggles shaped the world you inherit. Their survival made your existence possible. Their quiet victories over winter's cruelty deserve to be remembered, even as the specific circumstances that made those victories necessary fade into history. Sleep now in whatever comfort surrounds you, in whatever warmth you can take for granted. Let the story settle, let the images fade, let your mind release the cold and hunger and struggle we have shared. Let yourself drift into the ease of rest that comes from safety and warmth, and the knowledge that you are far removed from the hardships we have described. The fire that warmed those distant settlers has long since gone cold. The pots they cooked in have rusted into nothing. The food they struggled to preserve has long since been consumed or returned to earth. But the effort they made, the ingenuity they showed, the care they took to keep themselves and their communities alive, these persist, echo forward through time, remind us what humans are capable of when circumstances demand everything we have. And as you sleep, as your breathing deepens and your thoughts slow and the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes permeable, perhaps you will carry with you some small fragment of their experience, some faint understanding of what it meant to survive winter when survival was never guaranteed, when each meal mattered, when fire was life itself and community was the difference between enduring and perishing. The winter we have visited is over now for them and for us, left behind in history's frozen depths. Spring came then, as it always eventually came, melting the ice, warming the air, releasing trapped communities back into motion and connection. Spring comes for us too now, metaphorically. The release from this story, the return to your own life, the gentle descent into sleep that is like a small death and a small rebirth, a letting go and a trust that morning will return, that warmth will persist, that the struggles of history need not be your struggles, that you can rest in the comfort they did not have, secure in the knowledge that winter, in its harshest forms, has been defeated, has been relegated to memory and story, and the archaeological traces of lives lived in circumstances we need no longer endure. Sleep well, rest easy, let the story fade like smoke from those ancient fires, dispersing into air and time and the blessed forgetfulness that makes rest possible. The winter's table is cleared now, the fires are banked, the long night is ending, and you can release yourself into the warmth and safety of sleep. Grateful for the distance between their struggle and your comfort, grateful for the progress that makes such stories historical rather than immediate, grateful simply to rest, to breathe easily, to drift into dreams untroubled by cold or hunger or the anxious calculation of insufficient resources against too many days of winter. Good night. Wherever you are, whenever you are listening, may your sleep be warm and undisturbed. May your dreams be gentle. May you wake to a world that continues to move further from the hardships we have remembered together, that honors the struggles of those who came before while building something better, something warmer, something more secure for all who follow. The story is told, the journey is complete, and now there is only rest, only the soft descent into sleep, only the quiet gratitude for warmth and safety, and the simple comfort of knowing that winter, in its cruelest forms, is behind us, is memory, is story, is something we can visit in imagination and then leave behind returning to the ease of our own time, our own place, our own blessed modern comfort. Sleep now. The winter has ended. Spring is eternal in the safety of your rest.